If you are a Windows user or potentially even a Mac user, and you're looking to potentially try Linux, but you're a little scared, this video may be for you. And frankly, this video is also for me because I am kind of one of those people that's been considering moving to Linux in the future, and I have been doing a demo of Linux Mint for the past couple weeks, and so I just figured I'd give you a little bit of an overview of what this distribution and Linux in general looks like on a fairly modern computer in 2024. So again, this is Linux Mint, which is a really nice distribution built on top of Ubuntu, basically. The desktop interface is called Cinnamon, and so it's a pretty good little interface. It has a lot of really nice features built in. And one thing I would say is if you're coming to Linux from Windows, this desktop environment, Cinnamon, feels very comfortable. I would say it's much more similar to Windows than Mac, and so it does feel very comfortable coming from a Windows interface. For instance, if I hit the Windows key on my keyboard, I get a fairly good little rendition of a start menu popping up. It has plenty of UI features. It's got snapping, and so you can see as I move this thing around, all these different kind of snaps that are possible. And so that's pretty cool. And like I said, I am running this on fairly new hardware. So if I pull up my system information, you'll see again, I'm running Linux Mint 21.3, Cinnamon, Cinnamon version 6.04. I have updated to the most current kernel that's available on Linux Mint, which is 6.5. There are newer Linux kernels, but this is the newest one that's kind of baked in with Linux Mint. I am also using the Xorg X11 display server. I'm not using Wayland because it's experimental on Linux Mint. I have a AMD 5950X processor, and I'm running a NVIDIA RTX 3090. So it is a fairly heavy system that I've got. This is quite a bit more power than what I had on that old laptop that I was using in that previous video. The only thing other than the kernel that I've really updated as far as the base configuration is the drivers. And so here you'll see there is a driver manager for the display drivers, and I am on the newest NVIDIA driver that is in this driver manager. Once again, there are newer drivers out there from NVIDIA, but this is the most current one that is basically shipping with Linux Mint. That is the 545 driver. I needed to do that to get OBS, which is the screen capture software that I use, to function correctly. It was also necessary to get all the displays kind of working, because let me show you my setup. If I pull up the display settings, you'll see that I'm running 3 different displays. So, you know, I'm a bit of a display hog. I have a 48-inch LG TV as my main display in the middle, and then on the wings, I've got 1440p displays. Now, we'll point out, even without the new driver, all the displays worked right out of the box. What didn't work is the height adjustment. You can see that I can move these higher or lower so that, you know, their arrangement in kind of space is correct. That wouldn't work without the newer NVIDIA driver. But now that I do have the new driver, all that totally works. I didn't have to do any configuration or anything. Now, the one thing that is kind of a disappointment right now is that I cannot, in the default configurations, mirror any of my displays. I sometimes plug in an input tablet that works as a 4th monitor, and I like to duplicate my main screen because with that digital input, it's nice to be able to use it as an input on the main screen, and the little screen will kind of show in more detail like where the pin is. Well, whenever you have more than 2 displays, you can't do mirroring in the base display configuration setup. I believe you can make that work if you're willing to dig into some configuration documents, some actual file editing, but I'm not messing with that right now because I don't really do that very often. But now let's start talking about, you know, whenever I fired this thing up, what worked and what didn't. And the short answer is everything worked. And I mean, like, everything just worked. So obviously the mouse and keyboard worked and all the displays worked, but what else? Well, I've got an Xbox controller and I plugged it in and it just worked. If I go down here, you'll actually see there's a little battery, and if I pop that up, it shows my Tripp Lite UPS and my mouse. And both of those, I didn't have to do anything. They just worked. The audio all just worked, and if I open up the sound settings, you'll see that every possible audio device shows up automatically, and you'll see this UMC202HD. That's a Behringer audio interface that I use to get my mic into the computer. Didn't have to do anything. That just showed up automatically, configured everything there, just worked. I also have a webcam that I'm not going to show you, but just a regular 1080p, you know, Logitech webcam, but it was automatically functional right out of the box. I've got a Samsung network printer, and whenever I turned it on, it didn't just work, it automatically just popped up. I didn't even have to look for it. So a lot of stuff, again, almost every peripheral I have, totally functional without even having to configure anything. No drivers, no nothing, it all just worked. Now, what I did need drivers for, first off, was my little Huion input tablet. It's a Kamvas 13, and I did need to go to their website and download the software, but once I did, it just worked, and the digital input worked really well. Again, that's one downside with the screen mirroring, is I couldn't do the screen mirroring, but otherwise I could modify that configuration, and the digital input was very quick. There wasn't really any lag whenever I used it in GIMP. Everything, again, worked just fine once I downloaded and installed the driver, which is nothing different than what I had to do on Windows to make that exact same device work. The other thing that I wanted to try is I do have an Epson photo scanner, and again, I did have to go to Epson and download the driver, but once I did that, again, it was totally functional, and once again, that's the exact same process I had to do to get that thing working on Windows. So thus far, my experience as far as device support, even though I'm not using a bunch of stuff that I just bought in the past 3 months that's brand new, you know, everything I have, every peripheral just worked, you know, and almost all of it worked without even needing to download a driver. It was pretty amazing, really, the hardware support. I expected more trouble. Now, the next thing I'll talk about is getting software installed is pretty easy on Linux if the distribution that you're using already includes the software. Now, that may sound like a redundant statement, but I don't mean that it comes preloaded. I mean that the distribution has already configured that software for you and you just have to download it. So it's pretty common to have a software manager these days. And so in Linux Mint, you fire up the little software manager, and if there's a piece of software that you want, you can come look for it here first. So let's say I want to download VLC, which is a media player. You'll see a whole bunch of stuff pops up. The first two are really the only ones that we need to look at. Most programs on Linux these days come in two different forms, if not more than that, but let's say two basic forms, leaving aside, you know, compiling it yourself from source. So one is the system package, and so you'll see this is version 3.0.16. It's a 13 megabyte download, and it requires 67 megabytes of disk space. Now, there's also the option to do these flat packs. Now, flat packs are good in that they don't have the dependency issues that a lot of other software can have. It comes with everything it needs, and it runs kind of a little isolated container. And so here you'll see a much larger download, 774 megabytes, and it ends up eating up 2.6 gigabytes of space, but it's also a little newer version. The flat packs tend to be maintained by either the producer of the software or the community, and they tend to be a little newer on the versions, but because they include all the dependencies, they are also much bigger. So depending on what you need, it's usually kind of better system-wise to use the system package. It will work on your system, and it won't take near as much space. The trade-off is it tends to not be quite as new of a version of the software, so if you need the newest, latest, and greatest, well, maybe you go for the flat pack. But once you decide what you want, you just click the install button, and you'll see here, because this is for this distribution, it tells you, hey, here's all the other stuff that you have to install. If I go and do the flat pack and I hit install, it has much, much less because, again, it comes with all of the dependencies kind of wrapped up in the flat pack. So the software install, though, is very fast. If I do this system package and I allow it, you'll see it downloads and installs really, really quickly. And once it's done, and that's it, we just launch it. Don't allow network access, and that's it. It literally takes about 30 seconds for something like VLC to install, and I didn't have to go anywhere. It was just kind of already there in the software manager. Now, next up, for my purposes, my reasoning for doing this demo for me is I wanted to see, do the things and the programs that I run on a day-to-day basis work? So one of those is OBS. So if I pull that over, this is my screen capture software that I use. And so to get OBS functional, again, I just had to make sure that I was using one of the NVIDIA drivers, and everything else pretty much worked out of the box. OBS is open source, and it is available natively on Linux. So if I pop up the software manager here, type in OBS, you'll see I've got the FlatHub version, simply because I did want the newest version of OBS, but again, it's natively installed and functional. I do my thumbnail work in a program called Inkscape, and again, I'm using the FlatHub version of that, and it's available natively. I will say this is one of the pinch points is graphical design in Linux. I don't do a ton of photo work, and so I don't really need Photoshop these days. Inkscape, it's more of an Illustrator kind of software. It does SVG and vector graphics editing, but it's got enough photo editing tools for what I need to do, like thumbnails and stuff. I don't really like GIMP. That's kind of the big thing on Linux is GIMP, but I don't really like GIMP. I really think, Photoshop is just way, way better. But that's not available on Linux. And so the other thing with image manipulation is for raw photo support. There are some options as opposed to for Windows, I'd be using like Lightroom. And one of the options is a piece of software called Darktable. And so Darktable here is a pretty good piece of software. The problem for me is that my camera is not supported yet because my camera is a little newer. It's a Panasonic S5 2X. It's a nice camera, but Darktable does not yet support its raw file format. So that's a problem. I don't really need raw support, but I would like to have it, and eventually Darktable will get it. It's just a little behind. Now, if I was using Adobe Lightroom or Affinity, I'd already have that. But I don't even use those on Windows right now, so, this is a problem for people that need that. I haven't really been using it, but if I did, honestly, I'd probably put a virtual machine running Windows on here, and I would probably run either Affinity or Adobe products in that virtual machine. Now, once I get the video in, I need to edit it, and that's where Davinci Resolve comes in. Now, I've got Davinci Resolve already installed with its native Linux version. So Davinci Resolve is one of the best video editors out there, and it is available natively on Linux. But I will tell you, it's not all roses. There are a couple problems. One thing is audio support is a little weird. Davinci Resolve on Linux does not support AAC audio. So all of the audio files, you'll see this says Opus on it because I've had to switch to using the Opus codec for my audio because on Linux, in Resolve, I can't use AAC. What's weird is Linux does have AAC support. So if I play a file that's encoded with AAC audio, that actually works. It just doesn't work in Davinci Resolve. That's not a huge problem because it's very easy to change my configuration in OBS to just spit out Opus instead of AAC. So, that could be a lot worse. The other thing that really kind of stinks is if I go in here to Fairlight. So Fairlight is the audio editing engine in Davinci Resolve, and you can do plugins in here. So if I pull up the effects, you'll see all these different things, but one thing that's missing are VST plugins. And I do use one on Windows to reduce reverb on my audio. But I can't use that on Linux because the Linux version of Davinci Resolve does not have VST plugin support, because VST plugins don't work real great on Linux. I think there are some that work, but in general, it's not a really well-supported feature across Linux. So that's the one thing here that I am missing, that I can't use my single VST plugin, but there are plenty of stuff, and what I've found is that there actually is a voice isolation available that, you know, I can use, and it accomplishes much the same thing. So is that perfect? No, but it's also not the worst thing in the world. There's a pretty good workaround that does just fine. The other thing I'll point out is that my workspace, I am using the dual screen setup, and that does work just fine. Everything so far has worked really well in Linux on Resolve, with the caveat of the audio. The last thing with the audio is on the export. So, for some reason, the MP4 container on export will not export audio, and that's odd. So I've had to move to using QuickTime MOV formats for my export. Again, just weird audio stuff with Resolve, and I think it has to do with how they manage their codecs and things like that, and the licensing of those codecs. But those are the weird spots with Davinci Resolve. That said, all of that has been able to be worked around with very trivial changes. Like, I'm seriously, exporting as an MOV file rather than an MP4, really not that big a deal. Changing OBS to export as, Opus file audio instead of AAC encoded audio, really not that big a deal. And even, lacking VST support, I only used one, and I found an alternative that worked pretty well. So that's something that I could totally live with. So next up on gaming, I did fire up the rootkit, and we started looking at Helldivers 2, and I did some testing. I ran it both on Windows, the way my version is set up, and I also ran it on Linux. And I tried to use all the same settings, including overclocking, which is something that I read wasn't really possible on Linux, but it is actually. So there's a program called Green with Envy that I installed. So one caveat, I did actually have to fire up the terminal and enter one single command to enable overclocking. There's a little setting that you have to change to enable overclocking for NVIDIA on Linux. And so once I did that, everything here I can use, which is setting different power levels. I can set little overclocking profiles, and I don't have a lot. I'm not a major overclocker. I just have a little bit of bump in the GPU and memory, and I do limit the power to 350 watts in my tests. So like here, if I pull this thing down, 350, I'll hit apply. And so I did run my tests on both Linux and Windows with the exact same settings here. I don't know what's available for AMD video cards on Linux. I don't have one to test, but as far as NVIDIA support, it's been pretty darn good. There's nothing that I want to do that I can't do. So let's go ahead and show you what kind of graphics settings we're running. And this is going to be the same for both Windows and Linux. I am running 4K resolution in ultra quality on the render scale in full screen mode with 120 as my frame rate limit. One difference is I have VSync off in Linux while it is on in Windows for one reason, which is that VSync for some reason on Linux caps my frame rate at 60 instead of respecting the 120 frame rate limit. But otherwise, all the settings here are going to be the same. For graphics, we've got pretty much everything pegged except for shadow quality. You'll see I'm running higher ultra on everything, and I'm not using async compute. As far as the games themselves, everything on both platforms ran pretty well. Certainly it was playable. I did find out during testing that OBS is a pretty significant performance hit, both on Windows and Linux, but it seems like OBS has a bit more of an impact on Linux than it does on Windows. So whenever I wasn't doing screen capping, On Windows, I was running probably 75 to 80 FPS, and on Linux, I was running probably 70 FPS. So there was a little bit of a performance decline on Linux compared to Windows. Now, I haven't done any tweaking or configuration, but Linux ran maybe 10% slower. When OBS was enabled, Linux was running like 15 to 20% slower, because on Windows I was running like mid 60 to high 60 frame rates and getting down into the 50s, whereas on Linux I was getting down into the 40s usually. Now both were very playable. I never saw anything go below 30 FPS the whole time, and I'm running pretty harsh settings graphically, so it's certainly way beyond playable. But what I would say is overall, I did see a touch of a performance hit on Linux, anywhere from 10 to 15%. And the biggest thing is if you're a streamer, a game streamer, then I was seeing with OBS enabled 15 to 20%, and that may be a pretty big hit for you depending on what type of system you're running and how beefy it is and how much frame rate you need. Like a competitive game streamer who needs, 100 FPS, and, the difference between 100 and 80 FPS is a total deal breaker for you, well then, yeah, I mean, maybe you should just stick to Windows. But, otherwise, I found that performance was pretty great. Now, the last thing that I'll talk about is here on my desktop, you will see Autodesk Fusion. That is Fusion 360, and I do have it working. However, it's a total pain to get it going. It does run on top of Wine, and I would say as far as that goes, I would not recommend that method. I would say if you really need a good CAD piece of software, fire up a virtual machine, run Windows in that VM, and run your CAD through that VM. I think that would be more reliable, because I'm really just worried about this installation of Fusion 360 just breaking, because it was such a pain to get it going. And so, overall, my two big pain points, CAD on Linux, it's not in a great state. That's lacking. And frankly, the Adobe stuff. If you need Adobe, I really don't know what you would do except run a virtual machine or dual boot. The things that I really need, video editing, screen capture, gaming, all work really well. I mean, well enough to the point that, yeah, it doesn't bother me at all to run those on Linux. All of my peripherals work. So I would say that if you're coming from Windows, Linux, especially Mint with Cinnamon, is a very comfortable transition that I have found very few problems. Now, of course, I'm sure that there will be some issues and that not everything will always work. But thus far, my experience has been that hardware support is way better than most people let on. I keep on reading, people's comments about how hard it is and how much configuration you've got to do, but I encountered very little. I mean, I have entered some command line stuff, but mostly that was not necessary. I had to do like one command line prompt for Davinci Resolve. I had to do one to get overclocking enabled, but I mean, we're talking like one command, like a copy paste thing. So for the most part, it's just been plug and play, like very little configuration. It's been very basic stuff. When I did need to install a driver, it was very similar to what I had to do on Windows. Everything works. Performance has been quite good overall. My rendering and stuff is pretty much the same as it is on Windows as far as my video stuff, my capture. Yeah, so, I would say it's definitely something that I would encourage people, if you're on the fence, if you have an extra drive, dual boot that baby. Run it for a week or two and see what you think. I'm sure that people will run into problems, but you might also be surprised at the problems that you don't encounter and how nice it actually is and how functional everything is. So I think that's going to wrap up this video. As always, if you got any questions or comments, feel free to leave them down below. And as always, I appreciate your time.